I want to talk about a small subject today called the world. And there must be 101 public policy issues in the world that we're wrestling with, looking for solutions, still troubled by their consequences. I think of poverty exacerbated by natural disasters. I think of illiteracy. I think of the widening income gaps in the world, terrorism, food shortages, integration and diversity, political freedom. And I think of all of these issues, the most troubling one today is the issue of food shortages. The UN reports that during the last 3 years we've consumed more food than we've produced, and we've been living off reserves. How long can that go on? But that's not the subject I want to talk about today. What I want to talk about is the interesting place of the pendulum along the spectrum between business and government, along the spectrum between the private sector and the public sector, from entrepreneurship to red tape, from the marketplace to bureaucracy. And how do we reconcile that gap, which has been made more difficult by the last 18 months of the financial and economic crisis throughout the world? I go back to 1982 when then President Ronald Reagan, in the depths of another recession, world recession, which had hit the United States particularly hard, said, government is not the solution, it's the problem. And then fast forward to last year when President Obama said, government is the only hope for the private sector. In other words, you had reached a stage where only government, i.e. all of us as citizens, as taxpayers, as supporters of government, could enable the economic system to continue and to survive. So what does it tell us? It tells us it's a case of balance. We can't live by the marketplace alone. We can't live by government intervention alone. We can only live by a balance between those two forces. And so we watch the pendulum swing from one side to the other and hope that at some point it comes steady down the middle. So the question of balance between the private sector and the public sector, between business and government, between the marketplace and regulation. And the fundamental thing I believe about trying to achieve that balance is that we'll never do it in a world of ideology. Ideology is a prison. It's a prison for people who construct their own prison walls and are unwilling to look beyond it. They're neoconservatives or they're radical left-wing people who are unwilling to be objective, who are unwilling to analyze the situation and ask if their solution is the right one. It's interesting because there's an old Polish saying that under capitalism, man exploits man, and under communism, it's just the opposite. And what that tells us is that there are shortcomings in any ideology, and often the extremes are such that they end up as the same thing. So how do we achieve that balance? What kind of instruments do we have to bring government and business together in a working arrangement? And today, one of the really interesting possibilities is in the world that is called PPP, public-private partnerships. And there are those who believe today, and this is universal, both in the developed and the developing world, that public-private partnerships provide an opportunity to bring the best of the public sector and the private sector together. Public policy retains the control over objectives, over standards, over evaluation of the project. The private sector uses its best business techniques, business experience, financial management, know-how to deliver the product. So the government doesn't have to be the delivery agent it can enter into a partnership with the private sector and find a suitable form of delivery. Now, it's interesting that we're at a stage where that is still highly experimental. There are public-private partnerships all over the world. Just a few weeks ago, when I was in China, I heard about some of their notable successes and also some of their notable failures. And the point is that there's no guarantee that a public-private partnership is going to be the instrument of achieving that balance between government and business, between the marketplace and regulation, but that it has a very good opportunity if we're careful about how we arrange it, how we manage it, and how we fairly and objectively judge it. So, is this the answer? Is that enough? Not likely. We know that governments are expected to provide bailouts for failing industries. We know that governments are supposed to do something, but no one is quite sure what something is when you have a situation like Toyota, where suddenly millions of people are inconvenienced, are exposed to additional personal costs, and has government a role in to play in that process? Some think yes, some think no. The great concern today about the diminishing value or the disappearance of pensions and pension funds. And in Ontario recently, the provincial government has announced that it will provide some relief to the pensioners of Nortel Company. Does it stop there? How far does it go? If it were to apply that doctrine to every pension fund operating in the private sector, sooner or later, all of us, the citizens, the taxpayers, would be the source of pension funds for our fellow citizens. The issue of health care. We know that the health care budgets are soon going to consume huge amounts of the provincial government's budgets in Canada, and yet we're reluctant to part company with the totally public system of national health care to which we subscribe almost as a religion. And yet we have some paradoxical behavior. In recent times, the Premier of Newfoundland has gone to the United States for his own required heart surgery. And this has become very controversial because it's not like someone like me or any other private citizen making that choice. This is the CEO of Healthcare Newfoundland. The government of Newfoundland is responsible for delivering a healthcare system, and it can only be delivered by a public network. And if the head of the government responsible for that system goes out to the country for medical care, it would be rather like the president of General Motors going to Stockholm to buy a Volvo. That's the imagery that it depicts. And yet, are we entitled to impose our judgment on an individual's choice? The Premier is still a citizen, a private person, and entitled to make the best choice for himself. So these are very difficult and sometimes paradoxical questions. And finally, the whole issue of non-renewable resources. Who is responsible for that? A few years ago, it became clear that if the current practices continued, the coastal waters off the east coast of Canada and the United States would soon be fished out. If they're fished out, a main